I'm sitting there thinking, this guy's a KGB killer. Should I speak to him? And eventually I thought, I suppose I should say something. So as the meeting was breaking up, I went over to him. I put out my hand and I said, Mr. President, I'm Tony Abbott. I'm the new Prime Minister of Australia.
Hi, Tony.
Hi, Delia.
Thank you. Thanks so much for coming on the podcast. Shall we get straight into it and talk about how you grew up?
Yeah, well, look, I was incredibly lucky, Delia. I grew up in Chatswood, which is a suburb of Sydney. Now you'd say it's almost an inner suburb of Sydney, but then it seemed a million miles away from the city. I was in a little street, a cul-de-sac called West Parade. We had a paddock out the back, which didn't at that point have any animals in it, and behind the paddock there was bush, which led down to the Lone Cove National Park. So as a kid, probably from the age of about 5 or 6 onwards, I would spend most of my weekends roaming around the bush with the neighbourhood kids. We'd go down to the creek, catch tadpoles, throw rocks at each other. As we got older, we would get more adventurous, and we'd put penny bungers in bottles from the Scout Hall and corks in them and throw them at each other, and they'd blow up in midair. It's amazing that we didn't do ourselves massive damage, but that was the way kids grew up in Australia in the 1960s. There was no such thing as helicopter parenting. We roamed freely. No one worried that you were going to be abducted by a child molester. You just got on with things. When I was a little bit older in the 1970s in secondary school, my dad or one of the other blokes' dads would drop us off in the middle of the wilderness beside a river. We'd paddle down this river for 4 or 5 days to emerge somewhere else, and another dad would pick us up. And we were completely out of contact during the time because there were no mobile phones. Often we were going through areas where there were no towns and very few habitations. But that was just what you did back then. You got on with things, and it was a wonderful, exuberant, adventurous, I think, incredibly wholesome way to grow up.
And what was your family like?
My dad was an orthodontist, which is a kind of a specialist dentist. His specialty was straightening teeth. Half the kids on the North Shore of Sydney, certainly at the Catholic schools that I attended, had teeth that were straightened by Dick Abbott and his partners, Phil Kinsella and Dick Hay. And Mum had been a dietitian before she had kids, but once she had kids, she largely confined herself to looking after us. I had 3 siblings, 3 sisters, so it was a large-ish but not super large family. We were, I suppose, reasonably comfortably off. The kids all went to what we call private schools here in Australia. You'd probably call them public schools in Britain, but private schools in Australia are not as exclusive as public schools in Britain, although because about 30% of the school-age population go to private schools in Australia. So look, we were comfortable. We certainly weren't particularly well off. The first overseas holiday that the Abbott family had was in 1981, when I was 24 years old. So the idea that you'd just rock up to the airport and jump on a plane and travel for hours didn't happen. The family holiday, we normally had 2 family holidays. One would be a week at the Snow, Perisher Valley, where Dad was the member of a ski lodge, and the other was a week up at the Gold Coast in the summertime. So they were our family holidays.
And was that overseas family holiday before you'd gone to Oxford?
It was while I was at Oxford, in fact. Mum and Dad decided that they'd take the family to Kirkberg in Austria, which is a skiing village near Kitzbühel. So I flew. No, I didn't fly. I caught the bus from Oxford to Rome. I spent a week with the family of one of my best mates from school and university. And then I caught the train from Rome up into Austria, and I met the family in Kirkberg. So, yeah, it was a nice thing to do. In fact, I only saw my family twice in the 2 years that I was at Oxford, because even as recently as 1981, 83, international travel was a lot less common than it subsequently became. And the idea that you would go home for your holidays struck me as A, ridiculously expensive, and B, the waste of an opportunity to do interesting things where you were.
Mm-hmm. So what kind of values did your parents instill in you while you were growing up?
Well, Mum and Dad were, what's the right word? I don't want to say conservative, because that suggests that they were highly political, which they weren't. But it was a more settled world, at least in terms of faith and culture then. So we went to church, mass, pretty well every Sunday. As I said, I went to Catholic schools. Between the age of 8 and 12, I would walk with Dad from our place up to the railway station at Chatswood. He'd be walking to work. His surgery was in Chatswood. I'd be walking to the railway station to catch the train down to Milson's Point, where my school was. So we'd walk up together. It was about a 15 to 20 minute walk. We would chat about all sorts of things. I would ask Dad questions. Dad would answer them to the best of his ability. He would ask me questions, and I have to say that they were wonderful times, and very, very happy memories of those times. And I'm sure consciously and subconsciously I imbibed an enormous amount from my father in what we would now call the quality time that we spent together walking to work or school, as the case may be. My dad was a wonderful man. He's no longer with us, but I can remember I went from St Aloysius College at Milson's Point to St Ignatius College at Riverview, and I went from being a big fish in a small pond to being a small fish in a big pond. And at the end of my first week, I was feeling a bit distressed about this, and I
In what
blubbered
way had you been a big fish?
blubbered away to my dad about how I didn't have any friends at this new school, unlike the old school. And he said, and this is a bit of a cliche, but it's only a cliche because it's true. He said, son, if you want to have a friend, you've got to be a friend. And I said, so how do I be that, Dad? And he said, well, if you want to like people, you've got to focus on that which is likable in them. And in almost everyone, there is something that is likable if you look hard enough. And if you look for that and focus on that, and then do your best to let that other person know that you appreciate them, well, very soon you'll have friends. And of course, I was, I suppose, trusting enough in those days to believe absolutely what Dad said. And I then put it religiously into practice, and within 3 months, I think I was probably the happiest kid in the school, and certainly had no shortage of friends. It's extremely good advice that my dad gave me all those years back when I was 12. I haven't always been able to follow it since, but it was and is incredibly good advice.
Yeah, great advice. Okay, so then when did you develop your interest in politics?
One of the things that my mum used to do, God bless her, and she is still with us, probably every other day it seemed, she would bring me home a book when I was in that stage of first getting into reading. And you're too young to know anything about this, Delia, but back in the 1960s there was a series of books, Ladybird books, which Charles Moore, the Spectator's wonderful columnist, wrote about in just a few weeks ago. Ladybird books were basically brief, interesting, colourful accounts of the lives of significant figures in history, particularly significant figures in British history. And I can remember there were Ladybird books on Julius Caesar, for instance, on the Black Prince, for instance, on Henry V, for instance. I think there was one on Napoleon. I think there was one on Wellington, and so on. So I avidly, Richard the Lionheart, that kind of stuff. So I avidly read all of these books, and I suppose I developed a fascination for history and an interest in great people, the people who had made history and changed history. So I suppose that struck a spark in me, and I've had it ever since. And I still love reading history. I think that Winston Churchill's History of the English-Speaking Peoples is one of the great works of literature. If young people ask me, young people on the centre-right of politics ask me, what should I do to prepare myself for a possible role in public life on the centre-right, I say, well, you've got to be familiar with the culture. And if you want to be familiar with the culture, you've got to know its history. So if you really want to prepare yourself, the single best things you can do is read and reread the New Testament, because the New Testament is the foundation of our culture, and read and reread Winston Churchill's History of the English-Speaking Peoples, because that is the best, reasonably comprehensive history of our place in the world and how it's developed over a couple of thousand years. And there's a wonderful book by Andrew Roberts, who is not only one of the really great popular historians of this time, but a historian of Churchill. He wrote a wonderful biography of Churchill, arguably the best biography of Churchill so far, which was published a couple of years back. And he also wrote an excellent history of the English-speaking peoples of in the 20th century, which brought Churchill's history up to contemporary times.
So you were reading these Ladybird books thinking that you wanted to be like one of those people?
Inevitably, it's exhilarating and it's inspiring to read these great stories. And inevitably, you think, well, maybe I could do something like that. If not me, who? If not now, when? If not this, what? That kind of thing. So yeah, I was uplifted and exhilarated by that.
Mm-hmm. And what were the main things that made sense to you when you were younger?
Well, the Christian faith made sense to me, not because I was ever particularly pious. I was never an altar boy, for instance, or anything like that. Not because I was ever, particularly good. I was quite a naughty child in so many respects. But the Christian faith made sense to me. I had wonderful teachers, the Brigidine nuns at Holy Family Convent, the Jesuit priests at St Aloysius and St Ignatius colleges. Then when I went on to university. There were some wonderful chaplains, including Father Walter Drum and Father Rod Strange, the Catholic chaplaincy at Oxford. One of the Jesuits at St Ignatius, a fellow called Father Emmett Costello, was literally a second father to me. So the church made sense, and the faith made sense, but also I guess I had an innate respect for everything that had helped to shape me and the really rather wonderful community, society and country and civilization that I lived in. And I suppose that's what's at the heart of being a conservative, a respect for that which has shaped you. And that doesn't mean that it's all perfect. That doesn't mean that it can't or shouldn't change. But you take it seriously, you give credit where it's due, and you don't lightly change things that have stood the test of time.
So where do you think that awareness came from?
Well, again, I think, Delia, it was pretty instinctive. If you grow up in a good family, a good neighbourhood, a cohesive society, a just and fair society, why should you have radical thoughts about changing everything from the ground up? Why shouldn't you be rather opposed to suggestions that things are so bad that they should be radically changed from the ground up? I'm not for a second saying that everything was perfect in my childhood or in the country I grew up in. Obviously, there were attitudes that we would now think were outmoded and unfair towards minorities, for instance. But still, we have only become what we are because of what we were. And if what we are is good and getting better, well, what we were at least enabled all of that. So it should be treated with respect.
I guess I'm wondering, because I only became aware of what a good country Australia is after I spent time living in New York.
Right.
So, but I guess maybe was it through, and I do feel like that's the attitude a lot of Australians have about Australia, that it's such like a terrible place, but it's like, there's room for improvement, but have you been to any other country?
I don't get this, Delia. Why do so many young people growing up in Australia today think that there's something pretty terrible about it? I just don't get it. Can you explain it?
No,
what are you taught? What are you taught at school? I mean, I know there's all this talk about Australia Day being Invasion Day and Anzac Day being a kind of day of embarrassment as we went off overseas to fight in other people's wars. Well, I mean, again, when I was growing up, there was no question that Australia Day marked the beginning of this. The 26th of January, 1788, marked the beginning of something wonderful. And on the 25th of April, 1915, our soldiers were doing something that was brave and, broadly speaking, necessary, even if the Dardanelles campaign was a terrible failure and the Gallipoli campaign was, in retrospect, a costly mistake. At least the overall objective was a noble one, to make the world safer for democratic countries, and our people were doing something brave as best they could. So now there was a tiny minority that would question that. I suppose what was then a tiny minority has become, in some cases, what seems to be a vociferous majority. And I think that's sad, because it undermines our self-respect as Australians and as individuals. I also think it's wrong because, yes, there was the dispossession of Indigenous people in the times following 1788, But it was inevitable that at some point in time the modern world was going to erupt into this ancient continent and was going to convulse the way of life, the hunter-gatherer way of life of the indigenous peoples of this country. And for all the imperfections of the British settlement of Australia, I think it's probably much to everyone's benefit that it was indeed the British that settled here, as opposed to the French, the Dutch, the Belgians, the Portuguese, the Spanish, etc.
Well, I think for now, it's more about moving forward. And so I had Jane from the CEO of Children's Ground, which is this amazing charity that's working within the communities
Yeah.
to work on, like, this really cool thing that's happening in the Northern Territory with like a 30-year timeline. And I'd encourage anyone listening to this to go and listen to that, because
Right.
it's like that's someone who's doing something.
Yeah.
Like, how do we solve this problem? There are massive issues, but how do we move forward? And yeah, I don't think a lot of the dwelling, like a lot of the let's constantly talk about how bad we are as people is particularly helpful with moving forward, because we can't really change what's happened in the past. And it is like, when you look at, like, no country does it perfectly, and when you look at every other country in the world, it's like Australia's doing a pretty good job, and like very successfully multicultural country.
Well, Delia, I think you're right. When I was in Parliament, I tried to spend some significant time every year in a remote Indigenous settlement. And the 2 years I was Prime Minister, I spent a week in 2014 in East Arnhem Land. And then in 2015, I spent a week in the Torres Strait Islands. And that was really the culmination of things that I'd been trying to do for years to better familiarise myself with what was really happening in remote Australia. I mean, Indigenous people living in Sydney and Melbourne, for instance, have a very different experience to the Indigenous people living in remote Australia. And there's not that much difference, practically speaking, between the lives of Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians living in Sydney or Melbourne. Obviously, there's a vast difference between the lives of many Indigenous people in remote places and those of people living in Sydney and Melbourne. And rather than just get briefed and read stuff, I thought that it was best to try as far as you humanly could to live stuff. And I thought it was fair and reasonable as Prime Minister that I should spend 1 week, or roughly 2% of the year, in a place where I suppose 3 to 4% of that would be, if you like, the sort of spiritual heartland, if you like, of the place where 3 to 4% originate from. You know, it's pretty. I mean, people say how complicated it is. I don't think it is that complicated. Kids have got to go to school, adults have got to go to work, and communities have got to be safe. And the problem, I think, often stems from this guilt-laden assumption on the part of non-Indigenous officialdom that somehow Indigenous people are more different than they are the same. And as John Howard often used to say, the things we have in common are more important than anything that divides us. I think that Indigenous and non-Indigenous people are much more similar than they are different. And just as it would be wrong for the kids of Forestville, where I live, not to go to school 50 or 60% of the time, and it would be wrong if 50% of the adults of Forestville were effectively unemployed, and it would be wrong if there were wild parties going on every night in the streets of Forestville. If it's wrong in Forestville, it's wrong in Yuendamu. and it's wrong in Doomadgee, and it's wrong in the NPA territory, etc. And so we can really overcomplicate these things. And this sense of separatism, I think, is at the heart of so many of the difficulties that we've collectively got when it comes to the relationship between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australia.
Okay, this is totally changing topic, but I want it because I'm a big believer in that we all have so much more in common than we have apart.
Yeah.
But I wanted to ask you about what it was like. I have so many more questions to ask you about the priesthood and all of that, but before I forget, because I know we don't have that much time, I wanted to ask you about what it was like meeting Putin and what you think of him as a human and considering the Christian values.
Sure. Well, Delia, I first came across Putin as a real-life person as opposed to someone in the newspapers when I sat about 5 or 6 feet away from him at the APEC conference in Bali at the end of 2013. And I'm sitting there thinking, this guy's a KGB killer. Should I speak to him? And eventually I thought, I suppose I should say something. So as the meeting was breaking up, I went over to him, I put out my hand and I said, "Oh, Mr. President, I'm Tony Abbott. I'm the new Prime Minister of Australia." He looked at me and he said, "I've heard of you." His English is quite good. So, "Oh, right." And he said, "You're some kind of sportsman." And I said, "Well, as you are, Mr. President." And he said, yeah, but your sport, one of your sports is surfing." And I said, "Yeah." And he said, "I could never do that." And I said, "Well, why not?" And he said, "Oh, it's too dangerous, the sharks." And I said, "Oh, Mr. President, the sharks would be scared of you." Anyway, he burst out laughing. So the guy is not without some charisma, even charm, but as I later discovered, he is very, very different from the kind of democratic leader that we have come to know in countries like our own. For instance, I promised after a Russian missile battery shot down MH17 over eastern Ukraine that I would shirt front Putin, roughly tackle him. So I had my shirt front conversation with him in Beijing on the margins of the 2014 APEC conference. I said to him, "Vladimir, you and I need to talk." So the next day, I pulled him aside in a break in the proceedings and I said to him, "Look, we all know what happened here. A missile battery went out of Russia into Ukraine, shot down that plane, killed 298 people. I'm not saying that you personally instructed that battery to fire, but a missile battery doesn't wander out of Russia into Ukraine without your authorization. So I reckon you have got to apologise to the families of the dead and pay some sort of compensation to them." Anyway, he then gave me, and this was through an interpreter, because if he's doing an official meeting, he uses an interpreter. He gave me a long, long rant about how A, the Ukrainians are all fascists, B, it was a Ukrainian provocateur who'd shot down the plane, and C, Ukraine has no right to exist anyway. And I said to him, "Look, Vladimir, I get the Mother Russia stuff. I've read my Solzhenitsyn. I know all about Kievan Rus. I understand all that. But if the Ukrainians want to look west rather than east, surely they've got a right to do so." Anyway, he just gave me another long rant about that they were all a bunch of fascists and not having any right to exist. We eventually got called back into the meeting. So we're walking back in. He's a yard or two ahead of me. All of a sudden, he turns around and literally grabs me. He's quite a small man. He's only about 5'6". But he grabs me and literally physically shakes me. And he says in English, he says, "You are not a native Australian. I am a native Russian." And then he kind of pushes me away. And I thought, this is an absolutely bizarre incident. But what on reflection, I thought he was trying to tell me was that you people in settler societies like Australia and the United States, you don't get the attachment that we Russians feel to blood and soil. And for Putin, I am absolutely convinced everything that was once part of Greater Russia, he feels a kind of a mystical attachment to. And he sees his mission, his God-given mission in life, as being reclaiming for Greater Russia the lands that were part of Russia in the time of Peter the Great. And that's why if he succeeds in gobbling up Ukraine, Poland, the Baltic states, Georgia, Moldova, all of these countries on the borders of Russia can expect to be gobbled up in turn. And this is a dreadful prospect, an absolutely dreadful prospect. And that's why, in their heroic way, the Ukrainians are fighting for our freedom. And that's why it's incredibly important that we keep doing everything we humanly can to help them to succeed.
Mm-hmm. On that point of freedom, you, in your book, Battle Lines, I love how you describe what liberal values are,
Mm-hmm.
which is, so you write, we want each person to be empowered as far as reasonably possible to live the life that he or she thinks best. This reflects the confidence that we have in people and our conviction that they tend to get things right, at least where their own interests are involved. And I can't help but think if young people knew that's what liberalism is, it's like, why would you not be like, that's like all the marketing that type of politics
Yeah.
needs. But
Yeah.
where did you, as well as, and you also talk about like minimal government, when did you develop those views?
Well, I guess the instincts are forming from a very early time. The views leap into being when suddenly you've got to express something. And the views that you express are, if you like, a reflection of the instincts and the values that have been developing from the beginning. So that's really the best I can say there, Delia. I mean, the Australian Liberal Party, as John Howard again famously said, is the custodian of both the Liberal and the Conservative tradition in our country. And I like to say that the Liberal Party is the Freedom Party because we want smaller government, lower taxes, greater freedom. We're the Tradition Party because we respect the family, small business, values and institutions that have stood the test of time. But above all else, I think we're the Patriot Party because we love our country, we have faith in our country, and we want it to be stronger. We want it to build on its great existing strengths. So, as I said, that's, in my view, the essence of the Liberal position. And I growing up, I had a lot of friends who were instinctively Labor, and I think that's, and I don't think ill of them for this at all. It's an admirable and indeed an honourable thing. They had this sense that the working man wasn't getting a good deal, and the best way for the working man to get a better deal was through unions, through bigger government, through regulation, etc. Now, I think there was a much stronger case for that 100 years ago than there is today, at a time when we didn't have anything like the level of general education that we do now. But in practice, I've always thought that smaller government and greater freedom in the medium and long term was going to produce a better result for everyone, including the workers and the people who are currently less well off. And when I was the Workplace Relations Minister in the Howard government, I would often say that the Howard government was the best friend the workers of Australia have ever had, because under the Howard government, real wages, that's to say wages after inflation, were increasing at some of the fastest rates in our history. And in retrospect, the Hawke-Howard period was a golden age of reform, first from Bob Hawke and Paul Keating, but subsequently under John Howard and Peter Costello. It was a golden age of reform, and it was also a golden age of prosperity and widening horizons for nearly all Australians.
Yeah, it's interesting because here we have tube strikes, and I was kind of getting out of work. I had to battle through hundreds or thousands of protesters in Trafalgar Square.
And what were they protesting about?
Teachers unions. Well, it's just been constant strikes. But it's interesting when it's like looking at these people and they're demanding more pay, but it's like people demand things of the government, but it's like the government people, and it's like, where does that money come from? That comes from people. So
very sensible, Delia. Government doesn't have a dollar that it doesn't get off the people in taxes today or taxes tomorrow. And it's all very well demanding more, but what are you going to do to produce more? Look, I'm an incorrigible Anglophile, and I am full of admiration for the achievements of Britain over the centuries. The modern world was in so many ways made in Britain, and it continues to be made and shaped in English. The mother of parliaments, the world's common language, the common law, the Industrial Revolution, the emancipation of minorities, all of these things sprung from Britain. No country on earth should be more capable of looking after itself and standing on its own 2 feet than Britain. And yet, for the best part of a century, there's been this mindset of this defeatist, declinist mindset amongst the British establishment, which is just so incredibly destructive. And the whole Brexit thing tended to crystallise this. The Remainers basically thought that Britain couldn't cope on its own, whereas the Leavers thought, of course, Britain can cope on its own and it should cope on its own. And this whole kind of national neurosis is continuing to play out even now. And as for these strikes, well, I mean, sure, we'd like things to be better, but going on strike almost invariably, it's the adult equivalent of a child's tantrum. It's an expression of rage at the way the world is, which is almost fundamentally counterproductive. Just makes a bad situation worse.
Yeah. In classic British fashion, they were all kind of at the pub by about 2 p.m.
Well, that's a sign of their fundamental common sense and decency. They've made their point, and now they're thinking, stuff it, let's go and have a better time, drown our sorrows in a way that's actually better for us than waving our fists and screaming at people.
I listened to your Ian Dale interview you did.
Yeah.
Where you're talking about Brexit. And you say something on there about being not expecting to ever be Prime Minister because you had, was it unpopular opinions on unfashionable
topics,
topics. And I wanted to ask you how you deal with having opinions that others might disagree with, and that others might disagree with the point that they send abuse your way.
You've just got to accept that people will disagree, and in a polite but hopefully knowledgeable and informed way, you state your case and hope that others might take it seriously and maybe even in some cases change their minds. I mean, it's hard to change people's minds, particularly on things that are deeply instinctive, but nevertheless, it's important that we continue to debate the most important issues, because it's only by debate and discussion that we deepen our own insights and in the long run collectively come closer to whatever the ultimate truth is. I mean, while there's much to lament about the modern world, and I suspect the world is just at the moment going backwards a bit due to COVID, Ukraine, the polarisation between the democracies and the dictatorships which is currently going on. Nevertheless, when you compare the world of 2020, say, with the world of even 1900, let alone the world of 1800 or 1000, it's immeasurably better. I mean, the lives of so many people are so much freer, safer, richer today than at any time in human history.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I know you have to go in 5 minutes, so can I ask you the last 3 questions
Please.
I ask everyone? First is, how do you stay grounded?
I get plenty of exercise, because exercise is meditation for active people. I try to get exercise for half an hour to an hour at the start of every day. I try to ensure that I stay in touch with good friends who I've known all my life. And I can't claim to be any great Catholic, and I'm probably even less good now than I was once. But I do take religion seriously, and I try to get to Mass, if not every Sunday, at least most Sundays.
Next question, what book has had the biggest impact on your life?
Clearly, the book that has shaped everyone's life is the Bible, in particular the New Testament. If you go to church regularly, you hear the New Testament read to you whenever you go. And as someone who has spent quite a bit of time in church over the decades, I've obviously not just read it, but I've heard it again and again and again and again. But in terms of the books that I've enjoyed most and read most often, I guess it's Tolkien's Lord of the Rings. It was a bit of a cult book in the 1960s. I didn't get to it until, I think, 1978, when I was on a surfing trip up the coast. I had this dreadful lurgy which kept me in the tent for a couple of days, so I picked up Lord of the Rings and just kept reading. I couldn't put it down. It took me about 3 days to get through it, but it was a wonderful 3 days, and I think I've read it 3 or 4 times since. Most recently, I read it to the kids when they were teenagers, and they loved it too.
Amazing. What's your favourite story from the New Testament?
Well, I think they're all good. The prodigal son, maybe. The Good Samaritan. Perhaps the centurion who says, Lord, I believe, help my unbelief.
Okay, last question. What 3 words describe the best version of you?
Well, Delia, it's good that you refer to the best version, because I think all of us should strive to be our best self. And that means trying to be better today than yesterday and trying to be better tomorrow than today. But I've always tried to avoid self-description, because if you don't say you're the greatest, people think, hey, what's wrong with him? But if you do say you're the greatest, people think you're a tosser. So I'm going to leave the self-descriptions to someone else.
Okay, fair enough. Thanks so much for chatting.
Good on you, Delia. We should catch up face to face.
Sounds good.
Okay.
Have a good day.
And you.